She usually says it with confidence, calm, almost rehearsed, as if the discussion is already settled before it even begins. But this phrase isn't meant to reassure you. It's meant to control the direction of the conversation. When someone says, it's just a number, they're not answering a question. They're reframing it. The goal isn't clarity. The goal is to move the focus away from meaning and toward morality, making the very act of caring seem unreasonable. If you question it, you risk being labeled insecure or judgmental, and that pressure is the leverage. Psychologically, this is called preemptive defense. The narrative is rewritten before scrutiny can occur, not because there's something inherently wrong with a past, but because the speaker anticipates discomfort around how it may be perceived. What matters here isn't the history itself, it's how it's carried. Someone at peace with their past doesn't rush to neutralize it. They don't need slogans or justifications. They answer simply, or they choose privacy without guilt. Defensiveness often appears before criticism. That's the tell. This phrase also trains you subtly. The more you dismiss your own standards to avoid tension, the more you disconnect from your intuition. That's how emotional imbalance forms, quietly through small moments of self-silencing. You don't need to argue. You don't need to probe. Just observe, because people only work this hard to minimize what they haven't fully made peace with. This phrase usually appears when the conversation starts getting closer to something specific. The tone softens. The words sound reasonable, even compassionate, and that's exactly why it works. Everyone has a past isn't meant to open dialogue. It's meant to close it. On the surface, it sounds like wisdom. Underneath, it functions as a boundary test. Psychologically, this is a form of normalization used to reduce scrutiny. By framing the past as universal, the individual avoids discussing details, accountability, or patterns. The responsibility quietly shifts from explanation to acceptance. If you hesitate, you risk appearing intolerant or emotionally immature. But there's an important distinction here. Understanding someone's past is not the same as pretending it has no impact. A person who has processed their history doesn't need to generalize it. They can be specific without being defensive. They don't ask you to look away in the name of empathy. When this phrase is used repeatedly, it often signals an unspoken request. Will you be the one who doesn't ask questions? Not because questions are unfair, but because previous ones led to consequences. Listen carefully. This isn't about forgiveness, it's about leverage. The speaker is measuring how much ambiguity you'll tolerate in exchange for harmony. So don't rush to reassure. Don't nod automatically. Just notice what doesn't get said. Because when someone leans on generalities, it's often to avoid confronting something that still holds emotional weight. At first, this statement sounds logical, fair, balanced. It appeals to equality and modern thinking. But psychologically, it's not really about fairness. It's about permission. When someone uses this phrase in the context of intimacy, they're not making a social argument. They're making a personal justification. The underlying message is simple. You don't get to expect anything different from me. The issue isn't whether men and women deserve equal freedom. They do. The issue is that equality doesn't mean emotional sameness. People experience bonding, attachment, and detachment differently based on biology, personality, and emotional history. This phrase often appears when someone is trying to override their own emotional response by borrowing logic. Instead of processing how certain behaviors affected them, they intellectualize it. Detachment becomes framed as strength rather than adaptation. From a psychological perspective, this is emotional mimicry, adopting behaviors associated with control or non-attachment to avoid vulnerability. Over time, this strategy reduces sensitivity, not because the person wants less connection, but because repeated disappointment trains the system to expect less. So when you hear this line, don't argue ideology. That's not where the truth is. Listen to what's underneath it. Fatigue, disillusionment, a history of trying to care and deciding it was safer not to. This isn't empowerment speaking, it's self-protection. And recognizing that difference keeps you from mistaking emotional distance for confidence. This phrase is usually delivered lightly, almost playfully, often right after a question about direction, commitment, or intention. On the surface, it sounds healthy. independent, self-assured. But context matters more than content. Liking freedom isn't the issue. Using it as a response to emotional closeness is. Psychologically, this phrase often signals avoidance rebranded as empowerment. It's a socially acceptable way to say, I don't want expectations placed on me, not because expectations are unreasonable, but because they increase emotional exposure. People who have been disappointed repeatedly don't fear connection itself. They fear the loss of control that comes with it. Commitment requires consistency, accountability, and the willingness to be seen clearly. For someone who associates those states with past pain, freedom becomes a protective label. There's also a subtle imbalance created here. Freedom allows someone to enjoy attention, intimacy, and reliability without offering stability in return. It preserves the option to leave without explanation. True independence doesn't resist closeness. It chooses it deliberately. But emotional distance keeps one foot out the door, scanning for safety rather than building trust. So when you hear this phrase, don't translate it as strength. Translate it as information. It's not an invitation forward. It's a boundary marker. She isn't saying she doesn't value connection. She's saying she values control more than uncertainty. And that distinction tells you exactly where you stand. This phrase sounds mature, reflective, even wise. It's often delivered with calm certainty, as if the past has been fully processed and neatly resolved. But psychologically, this statement deserves closer attention. Learning and regret are not opposites. In fact, genuine learning usually includes regret. Regret is simply awareness, recognizing that a different choice could have led to a different outcome. When someone denies regret entirely, it often signals not healing, but protection of self-image. In psychology, this is known as cognitive reframing without behavioral change. The past is rewritten in comforting language so the emotional weight doesn't have to be felt. The word learned becomes a shield, not a reflection. It closes the door to deeper examination. Real growth doesn't need to be announced. It shows up quietly in change patterns, clearer boundaries, and different choices. When someone repeatedly emphasizes how much they've learned, yet their behavior remains familiar, the learning is still theoretical. This doesn't mean the person is being dishonest with you. More often, they're still negotiating with themselves. The phrase provides emotional relief. It allows them to move forward without sitting with discomfort. So instead of focusing on the statement, watch the evidence. Are the same situations repeating with new faces, or has something genuinely shifted? Words describe intention. Behavior reveals integration, and only one of those tells you whether the past has truly been resolved. You'll usually hear this phrase when past behavior is mentioned casually, almost with a smile. It's framed as distance, as if that chapter belongs to a different version of the person entirely, and that's exactly its function. Calling something just a phase is a psychological shortcut. It reduces complexity. It turns patterns into moments and consequences into experiments. By labeling the past as temporary, the emotional weight of those choices is softened. This isn't always intentional. It's a common defense mechanism. Detachment through labeling. If the past can be dismissed as a phase, then it doesn't need to be examined, integrated, or fully owned. But growth isn't about erasing history. It's about understanding how it shaped you. When experiences are minimized instead of processed, the surface behavior may change, but the underlying drivers often remain. Thrill-seeking becomes restlessness. Avoidance becomes inconsistency. Chaos becomes subtle unpredictability. There's an important difference here. Someone who has healed says, I made mistakes and I understand why. Someone who hasn't says, that wasn't really me. One reflects, the other edits. So don't judge the existence of a past. Observe how it's carried. Ownership sounds grounded. Minimization sounds convenient. Because what's unresolved doesn't disappear. It adapts. And if you don't recognize that, you may find yourself experiencing the same patterns, just in a quieter, more polished form. This phrase is often delivered casually, without emotion, almost as if intimacy is no different from any other activity. To many people, that composure looks like confidence. But psychologically, emotional flatness is rarely neutrality. It's usually adaptation. human intimacy isn't just physical, it's neurological. Repeated closeness triggers bonding responses designed to create trust and attachment. When those bonds form and break repeatedly, the nervous system adjusts. It lowers expectation. It reduces sensitivity, not as a choice, but as a form of protection. Over time, detachment stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like normal. That's when someone can say, intimacy doesn't mean anything, and genuinely believe it. Not because connection was never valued, but because expecting meaning became too costly. This state isn't empowerment, it's desensitization. Feeling less becomes safer than risking disappointment again. And because the process happens gradually, it's often mistaken for maturity. The danger is in the misunderstanding. Emotional numbness can look low maintenance, flexible, and easygoing, but numbness also limits depth. Where there's no expectation of meaning, there's no capacity for bonding. When someone tells you this directly, take it seriously. It's not an invitation to prove you're different. It's information about their current emotional range. You can't restore sensitivity through effort or consistency alone. That shift requires personal healing, not external reassurance. So don't romanticize detachment. Calm doesn't always mean stable. Sometimes it means the system has stopped reaching, and connection can't grow where feeling has been trained to shut down. This phrase is often spoken with composure, even pride. It sounds like discipline, like emotional control, but in most cases, it isn't mastery, it's exhaustion. People don't stop attaching because they've evolved beyond connection. They stop because repeated emotional investment drained them. What looks like restraint is often depletion. In psychology, this is referred to as defensive detachment, a subconscious strategy where someone limits emotional engagement to avoid further loss. The system learns that distance reduces pain, so closeness becomes something to manage rather than experience. That's why this phrase is so often misunderstood. Emotional burnout can mimic strength, calm can mask emptiness, and composure can hide the absence of emotional energy rather than its regulation. Someone in this state may flirt, engage, and even appear interested, but they rarely invest fully. They stay on the surface, not out of arrogance, but out of self-preservation. Attachment feels risky because it once came with consequences they weren't equipped to process. When someone tells you they don't attach easily, believe them, not as a challenge and not as a flaw, but as information. It tells you where their capacity currently is. You can't accelerate attachment by showing more effort, and you can't heal depletion by offering consistency alone. This isn't a warning about who they are, it's a statement about what they've lost access to, an understanding that protects you from confusing emotional absence with emotional maturity.